Well, the gas industry has been in the news, with Prime Minister Scott Morrison urging a greater debate around its use and energy source. The country's chief scientist, Alan Finkel, has also backed the government's call to support gas, suggesting it plays a critical role in renewable energy. In Victoria, the Andrews government, though, they don't want a bar of gas, instead subjecting their constituents to brownouts and higher prices as they chase these crazy renewable targets. Andrew McConville, CEO of the Australian Petroleum and Gas Industry Association, joins me now in our Brisbane studio. Andrew, thanks for joining us now. The PM spoke at the National Press Club recently. This is what he had to say: "We need to get the gas from under our feet. There is no credible energy transition plan for an economy like Australia that does not involve the greater use of gas." They must have been heartening words for you.
Well, I think they were sensible words, Peter. You know, it's a story that we've been pushing for quite a while, the important role that gas can play in terms of transition. I mean, no one doubts where we've got to get to in terms of greater renewables and lower emissions. The question is, how do you get there? And until we can get storage and system infrastructure that's reliable, gas can really step in and fill that role.
The Prime Minister also said gas can help us bridge the gap, while our investments in batteries, hydrogen and pumped hydro energy storage bring these technologies to parity to traditional energy sources. So right now, we've got to get the gas. Now, we've seen in Victoria where there's a moratorium, the Andrews government have a moratorium on gas. That must frustrate you.
Well, I think it frustrates consumers and it frustrates large manufacturers. The best gas is the gas closest to the market, so it's about how do we increase supply. And in the case of Victoria, they're having to import a lot of their gas now from Queensland, and so that adds cost as you have to move that gas. Very similar in New South Wales. So it is frustrating. I think it's frustrating for manufacturers and ultimately consumers, because the answer is more supply. And I think what we have to do is develop a considered plan. And it's not just gas, it's gas, it's renewables, currently it's coal.
Not a binary argument, is it?
No, absolutely not. And that's what Alan Finkel said on Wednesday. You know, it's an energy highway where every source of energy has a role to play. And you make the point about batteries. In a way, gas is the battery until that technology can get to the point where it's sustainable and economic. You know, it can turn on, it can turn off, and it can deliver energy and electricity right now when we need it. And it does have a lower emissions profile than some other forms.
It seems to me, Andrew, as if Queensland is doing the heavy lifting on this at the moment. How do you convince state governments like New South Wales and Victoria? And let's face it, I mean, this is an emotive issue. When we start talking fracking, when we start talking about gas, you do get, particularly in northern New South Wales, I mean, those sorts of areas, there's a very strong anti-gas sentiment. How do you get politicians on board to try and embrace the benefits of gas as part of the mix?
Well, I think you've got to do two things. I mean, one, you've got to respect and acknowledge those concerns of others, and you've got to sit down and have the conversation. You know, you've got to get in the room and be prepared to explain what the science is, what the technology is. I think you've also got to be prepared to back the regulatory regimes that exist. I mean, we have regulation for a reason, the same as we do when we drive a car or sail a boat or whatever it is. You know, regulation exists for a reason. So you've got to get confidence in that regulation. And then you've got to start to help people understand the community case and the economic case. And what we've seen here in Queensland, $70 billion worth of investment over the last 10 years. We've got a thriving export industry. I mean, these are things that are really driving the Queensland economy when agriculture, for example, has taken a hit. So you've got to get out there and really help people understand that case, but also give people the confidence that we have in place the right regulatory regimes, that we have in place the right checks and balances, that this technology is absolutely safe and it can deliver real benefits, not only now in terms of meeting that gap between renewables and reliable power, but as we go forward as well. It really can be the vehicle that allows us to uptake greater renewables and reduce emissions at the same time.
Andrew, you mentioned Alan Finkel, the chief scientist, and he did speak at the press club earlier in the week. This is what Alan Finkel had to say.
Solar and wind produce the cleanest electricity that you could imagine. Zero emissions, ignoring the life cycle analysis, but zero emissions as a marginal measurement. But they're badly behaved. They're not always there when you want them, so you have to firm them up somehow. You can firm them up with batteries at cost, you can firm them up with pumped hydro, you can firm them up with hydrogen storage. But today, you can very, very easily firm them up at unlimited capacity with natural gas.
Andrew, Finkel said, while these technologies are being scaled up, we need an energy companion today that can react rapidly to changes in solar and wind output. An energy companion that is itself relatively low in emissions and that only operates when needed. Natural gas will play that critical role. Now, this is from our chief scientist. The Prime Minister has backed the industry. I mean, it's a fairly resounding sanction, I suppose.
Well, it is, Peter, but we've still got work to do. We've still got to continue to make sure that it's economic. We've still got to make sure that we can help the community on that journey. I mean, quick example, when Melbourne had its really hot period a couple of weeks ago, the makeup of the mix just after dark was about 70% coal, 20% gas, and about 10% hydro. There wasn't any wind and there wasn't any solar. And it was the gas that really stepped in and firmed up the grid and made it reliable. So it can play that role. And as the chief scientist mentioned, it's also got a lower emissions profile. So that's good news here in Australia. It's also good news for the $50 billion worth of exports of gas that we're sending to places like China and India. We're helping them generate electricity as their living standards improve with much lower emissions. So that's got to be a good story as well.
All right, well, Keith Pitt is the new Resources Minister. He's a Queenslander. He's from the seat of Hinkler around Bundaberg. Now, the Greens in particular have been very strong on trying to basically tax you guys more. Pitt said this earlier in the week. I think the taxation levels are reasonable where they are and it will be steady as she goes, when he was asked about whether or not taxation levels on the booming gas industry should increase. That must give you some solace.
Well, I think it does when you look at the investments needed to bring Australia's substantial gas resources to market. Over the last 10 years, the industry's invested about $350 billion to get gas to market. And, we need certainty in terms of taxation. It's not about paying less tax or not paying tax. It's about paying our fair share, but doing so with certainty. And I think that's really what the Minister was saying, was the regime as it's designed at the moment works. The industry last year paid in the vicinity of around $5 billion tax, $70 billion over the last 10 years, $155 billion since the 80s. So the industry is doing its heavy lifting, but it needs to do so in a way that allows that investment to continue. These are long-lived assets, and that's really all we're looking for, is a stable, predictable taxation regime that provides a good return to the Commonwealth and to the states who own these resources, but also encourages that investment, which ultimately delivers jobs as well.
Andrew, just before we go, Pitt also said that he believes an expansion of Australia's controversial coal seam gas industry is warranted, including the contentious Santos project in northwest New South Wales around Narrabri. Pitt said, if we can drive down domestic gas prices, everyone's lives are made easier, particularly business. I mean, it's fairly refreshing, I would imagine, from your perspective, to hear that sort of talk from a federal minister.
Well, it is, and I think the point Keith's making there is that it's about more supply. If we want to get gas prices down in New South Wales, we want to get gas prices down in Victoria, it is about bringing supply to market. And that project at Narrabri, that could supply up to 40% of New South Wales gas needs.
40%?
About 40%. Now, at the moment, New South Wales is importing 96% of its gas from Queensland, and of course it costs to move that product. So we often say the best gas is the gas closest to markets. So I think with what the Minister is saying, with what Minister Keane is saying in New South Wales, we do remain confident. We've got to work with the community as we go through it, but that could really start to deliver some great outcomes for manufacturers.
There you go, Narrabri, 40% of New South Wales gas supply. New South Wales currently imports 96% of its gas from Queensland. Amazing statistics. Andrew McConville, thanks for joining us on Sky News Across Australia.
Good to see you, Peter.